Okay, welcome back. We'll move on now to the master comp. So if we create a new composition, and we'll call this master comp, and same length and size as our other comp. And the first thing we need to do is bring our still image down onto the stage. There it is there. And bring up our effects, and we're going to create a color correction tint, and the black is going to be a deep bluey green, and the white will be a blue green, somewhere like this. Take some of the saturation out. Probably on the black we'll take a little bit of the saturation out as well. Darken it down. And we might just put a curves on that and give it a little bit of contrast, and that's fine. So the next thing we need to do is just bring our graphic overlay in, just to see what that looks like. We'll get rid of our reference base, and to the master comp from project we'll bring our graphic overlay down over the top. Okay, so there's our graphic element. Seems to be working fine. And at this stage we can also bring our grid element in. Now this element, I'll double click, this is an element that I'll include in the project file, and I created it in After Effects using a circle shape and then the collider effect to get it to repeat over the surface, and just played with the settings to get a grid that I was happy with. So let's slide that down over the top of overlay, and we'll scale it using transform fit to comp, and we want that to, in fact, rather than mask it out with this outer scope here, I'll go back into the graphic overlay, highlight the scope outer mask, Control X to cut it, come back into the master comp and Control V, and we'll just leave that over the top of the comp. And we'll change the grid overlay to add, and we'll reduce the opacity by bring up T, and we'll take it down to about 30%, and that just gives it a computerized type graphic look, and that's working fine. Okay, now let's move on to some animation. First thing we'll need to do is create a new camera. So new camera, 35mm is fine, and then we need to create a new null object, and we'll rename this null to cam mover, and we'll turn it into a 3D object. We'll also turn our background into a 3D object, and that's all we need as 3D. Now if we take our camera, I'll just bring up my parent column, and we want to parent the camera to the cam mover null object. And now if we move our null object, the camera moves across the surface. So if we position the null over to the left hand side near this window, and just bring up P for position, we're going to click the stopwatch to create a keyframe at frame 0, and then we're going to come through to about frame 150, and we're going to move directly across to just past our targets, and then we'll come another to about frame 200, and we'll come past the first target and then at about frame 225 we'll settle on the second target, and at the last frame we're just going to give it a bit of a wiggle, and that'll help it feel a little bit more organic. And we're just going to play that through just to see how it feels. So we scan across, and that's not too bad. Probably takes a little bit too long to get there, so let's just grab these 3 keyframes, bring them in a little, and that's going to work fine. So that's our animation done there. And if we bring up our graphic overlay and shrink it down slightly, give us some space, the first thing we're going to animate is the movement of the horizontal meter. And to do that, we're going to use an effect called XYZ, separate position XYZ. And if you just type into your effects and presets XYZ, it'll come up, and you want to drag that down onto horizontal meter, and that gives us separate XYZ movement for that element. And it's the X value that we're going to wire to the position, the X position of the cam mover. So we need to make a bit of space here. So if you drag the tab so that they come up on top of one another there, and we can see the X position there, and in the graphic overlay come down to H meter, effect, separate XYZ, just expose the X there. Now we're going to alt click on the stopwatch, and we're going to drag the pick whip up to the first value, or the X value, and straight away you see that it's working the way it should. But if we look in the master comp here, you'll see that as the camera moves to the right, the element moves in the wrong direction. It really should be moving in the opposite direction. So at the end of the expression, we're going to type times -1, and that just reverses it. And so now as we move across, it works the way it should. And so that's that for the horizontal meter. We need to do the same now for the vertical meter. So if we bring up the vertical meter, we'll drag the separate XYZ effect onto it, and you'll see that it's the Y value that we'll be animating. So if we click down, effects, separate effects, and alt click on the stopwatch, we can pick whip up to that second value, which is the Y value, and there we have our animation happening there. And we need to do the same at the end, type times -1, and that gives us the movement that we want on those meters. Now we're going to do a similar effect with the text, so just leave that master comp there, and we'll come down to the horizontal number, which is this number here, and we're going to click down the text, and for the text source we're going to alt click and drag the pick whip up to the Y value, and now you'll see, I'll come in on that, you'll see that we have this long number happening here. So we need to mend that slightly. If you highlight the expression and put your cursor right at the very start of the expression, then hit the arrow for the language menu and we want to go to JavaScript math and go math floor. And what we want to do is remove the bracket and value, leaving the left bracket, and then at the end of the expression type the closing bracket, and that gets rid of all of those decimal points. And we also have those numbers are really quite large, and they're supposed to represent the bearing, so we're just going to reduce that a little bit. So if we go to the end of the expression, and just after the bracket, we're going to type times 0.05, and that just reduces that number down to something that looks a little bit more meaningful for bearing. And that's working fine. Now we need to duplicate that process for the vertical number. So if we bring up that vertical number, and I'll just slide over to it and bring up the text, source text, alt click and pick whip up to our Y value for the cam mover, and we need to do the same by clicking at the start of the expression, bringing up our JavaScript math floor, getting rid of the value and the right bracket and putting a right bracket at the end, and times 0.05, and that gives us those numbers. We'll just come back out here now, and that's all we need to wire at this stage. Yep, so we'll just bring our master comp back into this bracket here so we can see what we're doing a bit more, and we're looking pretty good. Everything seems to be working fine. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is tie a little bit of interactive animation with that center target reticle, and we're going to do that by creating a new adjustment layer, and we're going to place that adjustment layer down over the grid layer, and we're going to bring up, we'll rename that adjustment layer target hot, click OK, and we're going to add an effect to it of stylize and glow, and we're also going to add a color correction, hue and saturation, and we'll click the colorize, and we want to increase the saturation. 100% is fine, and the lightness just slightly, just 7's fine. And then with that selected, we're going to create a mask. So use the elliptical mask tool, drag from the center out, and just position it. We'll come in here, just position it so that it covers, and bring up the mask properties using MM and just decrease that, bring it into just inside the center, and we'll just increase the feather to 3. And that works fine. So we need to just give it a little bit of animation now. We're going to use opacity to do that. So using the target hot layer, click T to bring up opacity at frame 0, wind it down to 0, bring it across, and just before it hits the target, we're going to create another keyframe, and then when it hits the target, wind it up to 100, and then just before it leaves the target, create a keyframe, then when it's off the target, down to 0, and then on the next target up to 100, And same again, when just before it leaves, create a keyframe, and then when it's off, wind it down, and when it comes back on again, create a keyframe, 100, bring it through just before, create a keyframe, and off, and then just before it hits our final target, create a keyframe, and then when it's on, and then it stays on that keyframe, on that target. So we've got that animation happening. It's all fine. We need to click our collapse transformations toggle so that our magnification works. And that's working fine. And the last thing we need to do is, there's a little bit of a distortion on the original, where you see some distortion happening there. So we'll include that. If we go back into our graphic overlay, and the distortion is meant to represent the computer sort of glitching, and what we'll do is just create a layer, new adjustment layer. We'll call it distort. We want to add a distortion turbulent displace. We'll wind the size right down, and in the displacement pull down we want horizontal displacement, and if we crank the size, crank the amount, and just bring the size up slightly, 5 should be fine. You'll see that that's the effect that we're going for. Now what we're going to do is put a little wiggle on the amount. So if we alt click on amount, and we'll type in wiggle bracket 3, 100 close bracket. We'll see what that looks like. We could go a little higher, so instead of 100 we'll go 200, and let's make it 300. There we are. So that's working fine, and now to animate it we'll just hit T to bring up opacity, and we'll create a keyframe at the start on 100%, come through to about 20 frames, drop it to 0, come through again to about 80 frames, create a keyframe, come through to another 5 or 6 frames and crank it up, and then create another keyframe about 10-15 frames later and drop it down to 0. So that's the effect we're going for. You might put a little one at the end here, create a keyframe, and then at the very end we'll drag it up to 100. There we go. So we've got one at the very end which is 0, and then just before the end is 100, so it'll ramp up and then drop off. And back in the master comp we can see that that's taken effect there, works fine. And the last thing we need to do, we'll go into our mag comp, switch on motion blur, and for all of the locators switch on motion blur. We'll get rid of our reference comp, we don't need that anymore. In our graphic overlay we want the vertical meter, switch on the motion blur, We want the vertical number, switch on the motion blur. For our horizontal number, switch on the motion blur. For horizontal meter, switch on the motion blur. And we might as well switch on a bit of motion blur for that distortion as well. And that looks fine, it's working all fine. Switch on motion blur for that. And come back out into the master comp. On the background, switch on motion blur. And on the and that's probably it, just the background layer there, and everything looks to be working fine. The last thing we need to do is with our gradient overlays, bring up T for opacity, and we're going to drop that down to 80%, and that way it's going to leave a little bit of opacity over the top of our targeted image. So we'll do a RAM preview. Okay, so we're back from that RAM preview, and this is how our effect is looking. And there's one or two things that we can just quickly tweak. And the first thing we need to do is just make our position keyframes a little smoother. So if we highlight position and just click animation, keyframe assistant, easy ease. And the other thing we need to do is just put a little bit of random movement on the camera, just to give it more of a handheld feel. And if you bring up the camera point of interest and alt click on the stopwatch, we're going to type in wiggle bracket 1, 15. And that's just going to give us a little bit of random movement of the camera. Won't see it till I RAM preview it. And the other thing is the overlay element could probably, the targeting interactivity element, or the target hotspot, could probably come down a little bit in opacity. So just bring up the T, something like that. It's a little bit bright. And that's working a lot better. Okay, so I'll give that a quick RAM preview, and then we're done. Okay, back from that RAM preview, and we're finished. So what we've done there is we've used some expressions to tie the position of a camera over a still image, but that could also apply to some footage. And we've also tied some numbers representing bearing and elevation to that position data as well. And we've created a bit of a magnified center targeting reticle that is interactive when it hits on the target. A little bit of distortion. Hopefully you've learnt some processes that could be used in other areas, and there's some pretty valuable little tricks and tips in there that could definitely be used in motion graphics and some effects work. So that's it for this tutorial, and until next time, bye for now.